Example 1 is a non-porous surface. It's a glossy surface, and because it's a glossy surface, you're probably going to be using a technique which would develop it as if it were non-porous, and that would be something like a dusting powder. A magnetic powder would work fine for a surface like this. You could even super glue it and then dust the super glue. Here we have a white wall that's been painted, and so we need to be concerned about whether or not the paint is hard paint, in other words it's going to act like a non-porous surface, or is the paint semi-porous. If it's semi-porous, then over time the fingerprint residue is going to get inside the paint itself, inside the matrix of the paint. If we find it, if we get to the crime scene in time, within a few hours of the crime taking place, then we have a really good chance of just using regular dusting powder techniques to raise the fingerprints on that. Here we have a metallic door handle, and the fingerprints on this, first of all, you're going to look for them using an oblique lighting source, and because their fingerprints are on metal, you have a real good chance of seeing the fingerprints with the naked eye. If you do see them, then you should be able to just dust them, use a regular dusting powder to visualize them. You can also use a handmade or a commercially available super glue technique. Sometimes they have. You could also use a super glue technique in which you would cover the handle with the super glue fumes. And there are commercially available products that allow you to do this. So if you do super glue it, then you have the option of either staining it with a stain that fluoresces, or to dust it with a powder that will be trapped by the super glue itself. Here we have a ceramic toilet seat. Now, ceramic is a very hard, non-porous surface, so it's going to be amenable to developing fingerprints using dusting powder. Since this particular ceramic surface is white, we would want to use a contrasting powder. Black powder would probably work very well. Here we have a black plastic toilet paper holder. Because it's black, we need to be concerned with, again, contrast. So we're going to want to choose a method of developing that's going to give us contrast with the dark surface. Now, this plastic is non-porous, which means it's going to be amenable to techniques that typically can be used for non-porous surfaces. In this instance, you would have a choice. White powders are available, but they're not very sensitive. But gold powders, which are actually brass, can be used, and you'll get a nice developed fingerprint which would contrast nicely with that black. You could also use a gray powder such as dual or aluminum flake powder on a surface like this as well. This is a mirror, and you should be able to see the fingerprints with the naked eye using oblique lighting. So you take your flashlight and hold it at an oblique light and just kind of look around to see if you can see the fingerprints. To develop them, you can use a couple of different techniques. Generally, on glass, dual powder or gray powders work very well because they'll give you they'll look sort of like a silvery finish, and you'll be able to see that very well with different lighting. You could also use black powder, and since this is a horizontal surface, you would want to be using magnetic powder instead of normal dusting powder. This is a piece of plastic white silverware where the fingerprint would be on the handle of the silverware. This is white plastic. It would be a non-porous surface and should be amenable to either super glue fuming followed by dusting or staining with a fluorescent dye. The paper bag is going to be a porous surface, so you're going to treat this like you would most porous surfaces, and techniques such as using a fluorescent chemical that reacts with the amino acids in the paper should give a fluorescent developed fingerprint. And then after that you could do ninhydrin or another technique called physical developer, which would be also useful for this kind of a surface. Here we have a back plate on a door, and it's metallic, and because it's metallic it's going to be non-porous. So you need to think about the different non-porous techniques that you would use to develop fingerprints on this kind of a surface. And since this is dark, you don't want to use a black powder, you're probably going to be more interested in using a dual powder, which is a grayish powder to give a silvery finish. You could also use a white powder, but white powder is not as sensitive as the black powders. Or you could use a gold powder, which is actually brass powder, which would give a nice silvery or brass-like finish to it. You should be able to identify and develop the fingerprint very well. Here we have a black metallic table which is outside. And so outside surfaces present problems because they're exposed to the environment. In this particular instance, the table was exposed to temperatures which were down into the 20s and 30 degrees. And simply dusting the table was unsuccessful. So you need to think about these things. What is the effect of cold on fingerprint residue? Well, generally what it's going to do is solidify the oils in the fingerprint and make them relatively non-responsive to techniques for the normal dusting techniques. It's going to be inconvenient to superglue this outside, so you need to think of other ways to do that. There are a couple of techniques you could use. One, you could blow on it to try to moisten them a little bit with your hot breath and warm them up, and then try dusting. This really isn't a very good idea because when you blow on it, you run the risk of putting your own DNA onto the fingerprint, which would mix with the DNA that's already there. And because DNA is very important, you need to be considering how you're going to protect the DNA when you do your dusting. Another technique would be a technique which is called SPR. SPR is a solution that contains manganese dioxide in a detergent, and you spray this onto the surface. You spray this onto the surface. The water in the solution of the SPR, which stands for small particle reagent, is going to wet the surface of the fingerprint, and it should then allow the powder grains to stick to the fingerprint residue after you rehydrate it and warm it up a little bit. Another technique would be to use something called wet wop, which is really a powder suspension, a really concentrated powder suspension. And because this is a black powder top, you would be using a white wet wop or a white powder suspension. Probably that's the best technique to go because you paint the surface of the tabletop with the powder suspension and then wash it off with water. And because the powder suspension is fairly concentrated, you'll probably be able to identify the fingerprints pretty easily. Now, because these fingerprints are on a black tabletop, you should be able to see them with the naked eye using oblique lighting with a flashlight. The oils in the fingerprints should stand out, and you should be able to identify where they are using that technique. If you can't see them where on the tabletop using oblique lighting, then you might want to spray the entire tabletop with a white SPR. That might give you an idea where the different fingerprints are located. Now, if this tabletop had not been exposed to the elements, that is, if it was just a regular day outside, like 70 degrees and maybe 50 or 60% humidity, then dusting the tabletop with a gold dusting powder or just white dusting powder probably would have been just fine and would have no trouble identifying the fingerprints that way. So that wraps it up for this crime chat. I'm Dr. Shaler, and I really appreciate your watching, and thank you for joining me with this crime chat.